Hey friends, it is chrisloewen here again with another episode from our Outside the Walls podcast. In this podcast, we have a lot of conversations with people of different perspectives from what many of us would normally encounter on a day-to-day basis. As we have mentioned before, the ideas and the topics that we discuss in each episode are there for us to consider, but there is no expectation or pressure for everyone to agree, nor are these even official positions of Crossview Church. The desire in this podcast is for healthy dialogue from a posture of curiosity with the goal to listen and learn without feeling the pressure to agree with everything that is said in each episode. All right, so in today's episode, we have a friend of ours on the show named Susan Penner. Susan is the executive director of Life Culture Canada. She is dedicated to educating, equipping Christian and the broader public on the value of life, so as well as providing practical support for women who are in difficult situations. In this conversation, krisduerksen and I have a conversation about MAiD and what a pro-life response to this issue looks like. You will find out soon enough what MAiD is and what MAiD is not. But without further ado, please welcome to the show Susan Penner. Susan Penner, welcome here. How are you doing?
Really well. Thanks so much for having me.
No, this is great. Chris and I really look forward to the conversation. Susan, why don't you maybe just to start things off, tell us a bit about yourself and your organization and maybe how you came to lead it.
Sure. Well, I'm the executive director of an organization called Life Culture Canada. This used to be League for Life in the 70s and 80s for people who maybe are a little bit older. So it started off in the 70s when the legislation on abortion had changed in Canada in 69. And then Henry Morgan Tyler was setting up clinics in Quebec and then in Winnipeg. And then so a group of Catholic women actually started League for Life. And it was really, the prominent voice for life in Manitoba for sure in the 70s and 80s. It continued on more quietly over the years. And then about probably 5 years ago, I started volunteering for the organization. When I was in high school, a friend of mine had a teenage pregnancy. So I had always had an interest and a soft spot for the pro-life movement. Yeah, so I started volunteering. And then a couple of years ago, I was offered the position to be executive director. And so I took that. So for the past 2 years, I've been executive director.
That's so cool. So did this organization kind of start in Winnipeg? Like, did they move the office to Steinbach? Or how did that
Yeah, it
work?
started in Winnipeg. When they offered me the position, one of the conditions of me taking it was that the head office would move to Steinbach. I'm big on a culture of life. And a culture of life also means accommodating women who are mothers. So didn't want to, have an impact in my parenting too much. I still needed flexibility and to be able to be close to my kids because they're still in school. So I said I would do it if the office moved to Steinbach, and they agreed to that. And here we are.
That's so cool. So Susan, how would your approach to pro-life issues be different from the approach of a number of other pro-life organizations?
Sure. Okay. So, what I've noticed, at least maybe in Canada, is a lot of the pro life organizations do similar work in terms of trying to maybe impact legislation, or they're maybe more activist oriented. And there's certainly a place for that. I would view it as, they're reaching people who are ready pro life. So I felt like there was, a missing piece there where there's a lot of people who maybe don't know how they feel about pro-life issues, or even don't even know much about them, because in our culture, we're just told to blindly, accept abortion and now MAiD. So most people haven't even been able to have real conversations on these topics. So our approach is, I guess, more conversational, trying to reach people who have questions and aren't necessarily, 100% pro-life, but maybe there is some common ground. So we're just trying to reach maybe a different demographic than people who are just, 100% pro-life already.
I love that approach. So we want to dive in for this conversation. We want to talk. We want to go do a deep dive on what is the short form is MAiD, which stands for Medical Assistance in Dying. Could you just explain to everybody, Susan, what is medical assistance in dying? How long have we had it in Canada, and what's your position on it?
Sure. So medical assistance in dying, or MAiD, is the name Canada uses, and it involves two parts. It involves euthanasia, where a nurse practitioner or a physician would give a lethal injection to somebody for them to die. And it involves the medical assistance in dying, which would be a prescription that's given to a person, which they would self-administer. And this was legalized in 2016 in Canada. And when it was first legalized, the parameters or the safeguards were you had to have a terminal illness and your death had to be foreseeable. And that is the understanding most people had and probably still have of MAiD. But then in 2021, the safeguards were loosened. You didn't need to have a terminal illness. Your death didn't need to be foreseeable. So really since 2021, things have really started going, I'll say, off the rails in Canada when it comes to MAiD. I personally am against MAiD. I don't think we should be taking somebody else's life. So that's why we advocate against it. And believe people should die naturally versus being given a lethal injection or, taking their own life with a lethal cocktail.
So as I talk, and we'll all no doubt know people who are in favor of MAiD, whether it be, sometimes nurses in a hospital or friends or family members. Normally when I talk to people who are in favor of medical assistance in dying, I've never talked to anyone who's like, yeah, we just want doctors to start killing people. Usually it comes from a compassionate angle. Usually the people who are, or the ones I know, I should just say, the ones I know usually have known or seen someone really suffering for a long period of time with some kind of disease or whatever, or some kind of very painful thing. They're dying, they're in a lot of pain. And for compassionate reasons, they say, that person should have the choice to say, hey, I want to end this. I want my life to be ended so I don't have to continue suffering. So they come from at least some of the people I know, no doubt that's maybe not everybody, but a lot of people would approach this from a compassionate side. What would you say to that situation? What would you say to people who are in favor of legalized medical assistance in dying because they don't want people to suffer more than they have to?
Yeah, and I'm compassionate too, and I don't want people to suffer. There's a couple of ways maybe to approach that. Let's say if you're looking at it from a Christian worldview, the Bible does tell us we're not supposed to murder. We're not supposed to take somebody's life. So, from a faith perspective, that can be pretty black and white from that perspective. The thing is, if we're receiving proper care, most pain should be manageable and people should be able to be treated. I think what MAiD is signaling is, problems in the healthcare system now, where maybe people aren't getting the proper supports they need to live comfortably till they die. I know somebody challenged me once and said, well, yeah, MAiD is no different than, if a doctor gives a push of morphine at the end or somebody's in, terminal sedation. But they are different because the intent of MAiD is to end a life. When you give somebody morphine or when you put them to sleep while they die, that's giving them comfort while the natural process of dying takes place. So intent is also, I think, really important. The thing is, people already do have a choice if they want to live or die, and it's called suicide. But we are against suicide. Really, if we're talking in terms of just choice and personal liberty, MAiD actually adds parameters to our personal liberty, because we do have a choice if we want to take our lives or not. But for some reason, when it's framed as MAiD, it sanitizes it, sanitizes what really is suicide. It's just somebody else, doing it on you. So there are definitely some challenges. I think it's interesting. Maybe I'll just give an example. From the time MAiD was introduced in 2016 to the end of October 2022, there's some stats I saw from Ontario. And in that time frame, 13,011 people in Ontario died by MAiD. Only 3 of those people self-administered. So there is some sort of psychological component where people do not want to do the act on themselves. They do not want to take the medication to end their lives. But there's a difference when somebody else is giving the injection. So there's psychology involved in this too, obviously.
Thank you. By the way, Susan, this is so good, and your knowledge on these topics and stuff is so helpful. So back to this situation. So let's talk about the compassionate situation. Someone's suffering. Let's say an elderly person, terminal illness, lots and lots of pain. Now, I personally, and no doubt both of you guys too, and many people listening to this podcast, have probably known a grandparent or a great-grandparent or someone has had someone in their life who is terminally ill. They're going to die. They're suffering. And now, okay, so should the doctors be trying to keep this person alive as long as possible? What's the difference between, because I think in some cases, like I've had ones where it's like you don't even really want to admit it, but inside you're like, maybe it might be better for this person to die. And I know that you know about these kinds of situations as well. So what would you say in that situation? Is there a difference between letting someone die, actively killing them, or what should we be doing in those situations?
I actually think in general, we need to assess how long we try and keep somebody alive. MAiD is not advocating for disproportionate medical intervention to keep somebody alive. If somebody's dying, there's a reasonable case to say, you know what, I don't want treatment. I just actually want to, let nature take its course, so to speak. So MAiD isn't trying to keep somebody alive. And I think the other piece is a really good book called, what's it called now? Okay, I forget what it's called now, but where it just talks about how when somebody's diagnosed, let's say, with cancer, they can choose, if they want aggressive treatment, if they want no treatment, and how long does the aggressive treatment extend their life by? Maybe 2 weeks. Well, is it worth going through that aggressive treatment to only extend your life by a certain amount of time? So when you look at the medical system, their goal is to keep people alive, right? Or it has been up until now. You want to figure out how to get people to live. But there is a reasonable case to be made for, if that treatment is going to be, really difficult and hard on a person, there's a reasonable case to say, actually, I don't want the treatment. I'll die naturally. But one of the reasons people, when they're diagnosed, make some of these decisions to really aggressively treat something is because they're not talking about it ahead of time. Really, we should be having conversations about, what happens if I get diagnosed with cancer or whatever it would be. We should be having those conversations before we actually get a diagnosis. Because when people are in crisis situations, you get a diagnosis, and maybe the parent, the kids don't want the parent to die. So they push, no, get treated. You have to live. When really the best thing might just for somebody to die naturally. So again, all this to say, MAiD is not advocating for keeping people alive indefinitely or artificially. What what we're advocating is we do not intentionally kill someone.
Right. So the pro-life position that you're advocating here isn't, we got to just do everything we can to keep someone alive. We got to keep resuscitating them. We got to keep them. Actually, you're advocating live well, die well. In some cases, less treatment might be better so you can live well with the time you have. The point is just, it's okay to let someone die. It's not okay to put someone to death.
And, the other thing is with these extreme cases you're talking about, people always, in a way, they're red herrings because we use these extreme cases to make these general laws. And you know what? Sometimes we can't make general laws based on the extreme cases because it impacts more than just the extreme case. If you look even a situation like abortion, so many people support abortion because if a woman gets raped, well, that's 1% of abortions, right? But so now the 99% of the other abortions are allowed, even though they're not because of rape. And I look at that with MAiD as well. If somebody's really in extreme suffering and almost at the end of life, that's a unique, rare situation. That doesn't mean we should have broad laws to accommodate those specific situations. And in Canada, when the legislation was initially introduced, what you're speaking of was the intent. And it was why it got a lot of support, because people were like, and politicians were like, yeah, it makes sense if somebody's really suffering. But then in 2021, they go and blow open, the parameters. And that's where the real issue is coming. I'll just give an example just to give some perspective. MAiD was introduced in California in 2016, the same year as Canada. And we have about equal populations, 38, 39 million. In 2021, in California, 486 people died by MAiD. And in Canada, 10,064 died by MAiD. So you can just tell, and California is a pretty, known as a pretty progressive liberal state, but Canada is just like blowing them out of the water when it comes to this. And that's because California has the legislation where you have to be terminal and your death has to be foreseeable. Where in Canada, those parameters have totally opened up.
Oh, interesting. So in California, can you just run that by us again? What are the parameters in order to choose, I want you to put me to death, essentially. I want you to end my life. What do I have in California?
Yeah. So in California, you have to be terminal and your death has to be foreseeable. And my understanding is the patient has to take the medication themselves. It's not doctor injected. Whereas in Canada, it's euthanasia. Primarily a doctor does the injection, or a nurse practitioner. And then the parameters, you don't need to be terminal. You don't even need to have a disease necessarily, right? You just have suffering. It's quite broad in Canada and how it can be interpreted. So then now you see the 468 versus the 10,064, a massive difference. So the laws matter for sure.
Very, very interesting. I appreciate some of these nuances. And maybe just to back up a little bit, Chris, you referred to showing some of your grandparents. I too have 3 grandparents that passed away, and they were given some kind of a morphine or narcotic of some kind to help with that the dying process. And I've often heard, and I just the other day I heard it again, that morphine can speed the process of dying. Is that something that you've heard of? Like, can you respond to that?
I mean, I'm not a doctor or a nurse.
Right.
My understanding is what it does is it helps, the person relax, right?
Okay.
And when a person is more relaxed, it can speed up the process of dying.
Okay.
But I'm not sure from the medical perspective.
Yeah.
But again, that is a situation where you're allowing a person to be in comfort while they're dying naturally versus intentionally injecting them with something to end their life.
So what are some of the situations? Okay, so we've talked about, I think it's important to talk about that because I think usually, or at least here in Canada, or I think for most people when they think about MAiD, putting people to death in a hospital, I think most people are thinking about older people probably with terminal illnesses that are going to die anyway. So we've talked about that and the compassion side of that. And in a place like California, where they have those parameters in, the number of people choosing it is down. So what are the situations that keep you up at night? So it doesn't sound like those are the situations that are keeping you up at night. What are the situations like once you kind of open the doors to this? What are the actual situations on the ground that concern you right now with what's happening in Canada?
Okay, so what concerns me is if you look at Canada, let's say if you look at countries in Europe that allow euthanasia, the way they're handling it is different. For example, a patient needs to bring it up with the doctor. The doctors can't express it as a form of treatment, right? So what's happening in Canada, right? If you get diagnosed and, a doctor can say, okay, you can have your chemo, you can do nothing, or you can have MAiD. So it's being presented as this treatment option. So people are beginning to feel pressure and obligated to choose it versus if they would have to start the conversation with the doctor like they do in virtually every other country, I think.
That's fascinating.
And the thing is, it's impacting the overall level of care in the healthcare system, right? So if somebody is diagnosed and will need palliative care, and by palliative, I don't mean end of life necessarily. It's like from time of diagnosis. and maybe they have a complicated situation, and it's going to cost a lot of money or whatever it is. It's easier even for maybe our medical system to say, MAiD's a good option for you, right? So we talk about MAiD and somebody's personal autonomy, it's their choice. Well, that's not entirely true, because it impacts the entire system, which is going to impact each one of us. A story, I was in Vancouver speaking recently, and a gentleman came up to me and he was really emotional. And he just said his brother had chosen to die by MAiD 2 weeks prior. Nobody in the family knew. Because in the 2021 legislation, now medical professionals can sign off, be the witness, where it used to have to be a family member would have to sign off as a witness. And this gentleman said to me, how is it that doctors who've seen my brother for a few appointments are now signing off on him ending his life, and family who we've been with him his entire life have no say, have no clue it's even happening? So those stories are really,
it almost seems like a potential conflict of interest is almost created, or that would be concerning, right? Like what you're saying here is in Europe, they have this rule, the doctor doesn't bring it up. You have to bring it up.
Yeah.
But now you have a person who, and again, I know our doctors are well-meaning, awesome people, right? Like nobody's blaming. What we're saying is the system is almost creating a potential conflict of interest, because you have someone who's busy, who has, we need to clear up beds or whatever. You could have someone, it could create a situation where someone who has a vested interest, like it might be easier if this person died, bringing it up.
And most doctors I've talked to, or the ones who've reached out, they do not support this. It's more of a political government decision. The push did not come from the medical community, at least initially. And now, I was on Twitter recently, and the Department of Justice has a tweet: find out if you're eligible for MAiD, if you meet all the criteria. On the government's website, there's if you're interested in MAiD but don't have a family doctor, don't worry, call this number and we can still, get you paneled, basically. So it's not just that, okay, MAiD has been approved. If, somebody's end of life and they're suffering and want to choose it, they can talk to their doctor about it. It's being marketed. It's being promoted by our government, which is very deeply concerning in my mind.
And different, what you're saying here too is, there are a number of other Western countries that have made laws, like California. I don't know what other states in the United States, Europe. And what you're saying, and this is, concerning, particularly when you see that we kind of stick out in the way we're approaching this.
Well, Canada is literally a case study for other countries how not to do it. And I know there are countries who are voting against implementing it based on what they're seeing happening in Canada. So if there's any good to come from this, maybe it'll slow down, other countries implementing it, because Canada is literally probably the world leader in terms of ease of getting MAiD.
And Chris, I know you have something that you want to ask. I just wanted to, just on this one thing, let's assume, I like to assume, I think most people have good motives. Again, I think most people, even with this MAiD stuff, I think most of the people who are in favor of MAiD, they have a picture in their mind of the suffering part. What's interesting, and I get that, I totally get that, and we need to, have that conversation. How do we keep people from suffering excessively and unnecessarily? Mm-hmm. But it seems like out of this good motive of not suffering, you create, I think, an unintended consequence, because I'm just imagining myself and certain personalities. My personality might not even be the best one, but I know certain personalities that they always want to serve. They don't want to be a burden. I don't know. I'm sure we all know people who just don't want to be a burden. Now imagine unintended consequence. You have a person who doesn't want to be a burden, who's in a hospital because they need all kinds of interventions to keep them alive. That costs money, that costs time, that costs energy to doctors and nurses. And now the option of MAiD is out there. Now the point of offering the option was not to make people feel guilty. But now imagine you have people now in a hospital who feel guilty for choosing life and it's almost like they're a burden of the hospital. I mean, is that something you've ever thought of? I don't know. That to me, that sounds like a potential unforeseen consequence that could be really terrible.
Well, first of all, when you talk about most people have good intentions, yes, I understand that maybe most of the average people do, but from a political perspective, we have a universal healthcare system that is unsustainable with an aging population. So I'm not sure that the government is entirely altruistic when it comes to MAiD. It saves a fortune in healthcare costs at end of life, because end of life, as people get older and get sick or get diseases, it just costs more to treat. So maybe the average person, when you talk to them, do you support it? And they think, oh yeah, like end of life, if somebody's suffering, yeah, their intentions may be good. I'm not sure it's quite that pure from the government perspective. But if you look at the government's report on MAiD, that they have it on their website, the primary reasons people choose MAiD are not because of pain or suffering. It's because they do not want to be a burden. They've lost the ability to do, meaningful activities. So when you look at it, MAiD, personally, I think MAiD is more of a social issue than it actually is a medical issue, because most pain can be managed, and pain is not the reason why people are choosing it. So that's what we're being told, and that's what people, they can rationalize in their head. We don't want people to suffer, but that's not actually why people are choosing it. Sure, there are going to be people who choose it, but people are choosing it. They're scared of potential pain. So some people are in pain, but some people are just scared of potential pain. They're not even in pain yet. Some people don't want to be a burden to their families. And it's hard getting older. It's hard getting older, for sure. Nobody wants to lose their independence, those types of things. But from when I look at the data and I hear tons of stories from people, to me, it seems more of a social problem. I think our country, our culture is so individualistic. And I think now we're beginning to see the negatives of that. People are lonely, they're isolated, a lot of this is relational. And we have one volunteer, she used to live in Ontario, and she worked at a hospice there. And so when patients would come to the hospice, they're expected to live, maybe have 3 weeks left. And she said it was just really the most beautiful experience. She said families would reconcile. They'd, be holding vigil by the person who's dying's bedside. She just said, like, MAiD just hijacks a lot of that type of thing. And I was talking to a funeral director recently, and now they're beginning to get people who have died by MAiD. And he said to me, he's never seen conflict in families like he has with a parent, let's say, who's died by MAiD, because some of the kids didn't want it. Some of the kids thought it was fine. It's not the natural order of things. So I think from a social perspective, I think we need to view it partly from a social perspective. It's an easy, maybe, solution to what are deep social problems in terms of relationships and independence and loneliness and isolation.
I wonder if it almost becomes a shortcut that keeps us from thinking of more creative ways to help people live better. It's cheaper. Anyway, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the nuance there that you made between it being a social issue and a medical issue. I hadn't actually considered that before, so I thank you for that. And especially when you throw in a political aspect, it just makes it a whole lot more messy. So related to that question is maybe this next one, and it's related to the whole idea of the quality of life. Are there situations already occurring in Canada where people are being offered MAiD because of quality of life issues instead of simple solutions that would otherwise give them a desire to live? Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, like, I'm going to tell you a quick personal story. In January, I got an email from a woman, a 38-year-old woman who's visually impaired. She's living in downtown Winnipeg, didn't feel safe where she was living. She was struggling with mental illness because she was so isolated and didn't feel she could leave her apartment. She emailed me and she said, "You are my last hope. I'm going to be paneled for MAiD. You're my last hope to stay alive." And this is a woman who has faith. She was a Christian woman, right? But she was like, "You're my last hope." So I messaged her back and it's like, just to tell me a little bit about yourself, etc. So we had some conversations. And what I discovered is she needed to move. She needed a different place to live because where she was living was she didn't feel safe. It was contributing to the isolation. So she needed a different neighborhood to live in, and she was lonely. So what we did as an organization is we gave her some money to help her move to a different location and city. And I had 2 of her volunteers commit to emailing her once a week. Okay, so that's all we did. A couple of months later, so this would be now early March maybe, she emailed me. Her whole life has changed. She was able to find an apartment. It's close to a bus stop. It's within walking distance of a grocery store. These are important to somebody who's visually impaired. And then she said, "Thank you so much for my new friends." Well, these new friends were 2 volunteers committing to email once a week. It's not a lot. Wow. And it's totally changed her life. And then so what I did is I said, okay, like if you could maybe put together some resources for other people who, feel like you did or in that situation. So now she's starting to get involved and doing stuff. She feels like her life has meaning again. And it's totally changed her whole life. And it didn't really take a lot. It took a little bit of money and a couple of people who, made friendships with her. So I think from that situation, we see, again, the social side of things. And I mean, I have heard there's numerous stories of people who are in poverty, who they're tired of being poor. They can't get the assistance they need, or people struggling with mental illness. Like mental illness, if you need help for mental illness, you can be waiting for months, if not years. Those same people, can be paneled for MAiD within days. So I think, again, like we talked about, a lot of this is social. I mean, the primary reason is people choose it is 70% of people choose MAiD because of cancer. And again, not all those are for pain. Some of that's preventative. They don't want to be in pain. They want to die with dignity, etc. But there's a lot of these social issues that are coming up for sure.
And just an example of how talk about, just having the option of MAiD can shortcut all this, because it was work what you did. You had to meet with this woman, talk with this woman, help out with some money, blah, blah. But think of the beauty of this. It's a saved life. When people choose MAiD too quickly, I mean, it's a shortcut. It just shortcuts the whole system and keeps us from having to actually work to keep people alive, which I think is good for all of us in our society.
Well, and I really can't count how many people who struggle with, depression have talked to me and said if MAiD had been available when they were struggling with depression at their lowest point, they would have chosen it 100%. And it's people who have mental illness who have talked to me and said, like, this makes no sense, because you don't kill a person when they're at their lowest point.
Yeah.
So I hear a lot of that, and I was at a webinar recently where a Canadian senator was speaking, and she supported the 2016 legislation of MAiD, and now she is against since 2021 with all the changes.
Oh, interesting.
This has gone way too far. And she said that at some of the hearings that were going on about MAiD, because they were going to revise this, they're always revising the legislation. I think she said 70 disability groups showed up in Ottawa to speak against it. Or maybe they went in by Zoom. I'm not sure how it was. 70 disability groups spoke against it on deaf ears from the government. Disability groups are advocating against this. Mental health organizations are advocating against it. It's discrimination, right? Because who's going to choose MAiD? It's the elderly, it's the disabled, it's the vulnerable, it's people with mental illness. These are exactly what does that? That's kind of eugenic, to be honest. That's the vulnerable people are going to be affected by this. What does that say? I
wonder how many other Canadians are out there. It's interesting you bring up this senator. If you also remember the name, let us know.
I'll get it to you.
Yeah, but I wonder how many other Canadians actually who have been in favor of MAiD in very restricted sense. There might be overlap with a lot of people, pro-life people and Christians, where there's some overlap where I think we can agree with a big chunk of people maybe that, hey, let's close this door down and make it a lot narrower at the very least.
Yeah, and I'm under no illusion. MAiD is here now. I'm not under the illusion it's going anywhere. But when I write a letter to the Minister of Health I ask, can you please bring the parameters back to the original 2016 legislation? I personally don't like that.
Right.
Like, I don't
Yeah.
support that.
Mm-hmm.
But I understand we live in a pluralistic culture and all that, and people have strong feelings. You know what? Can we at least bring it back to what it was originally intended? Because now it is just way too broad. So again, most people, like the majority of Canadians, support MAiD, but they are under the impression that it's exactly that end of life suffering piece, and that's not what it's become. And I think so. You know, our country's so big on personal autonomy, but the challenge is personal autonomy. Like I said before, it's not really that personal. It impacts our entire society when you open things up, like they're being opened up right now.
Yeah, just the availability of the choice changes
Mm-hmm.
it for even me. If I go in the hospital, it's a choice. Now I have to think about, I didn't go to the hospital thinking I could choose death. But now that that choice is there, I might have to feel guilty for not choosing death, right? Anyway, go ahead,
Well,
Chris.
and think about it. Like, again, I hear lots of stories from people. There are people who are scared to let their parents go to the hospital now because their parent is in the hospital. They're in a hospital room, the kids are there, and then, you know, somebody from the MAiD team or a nurse or somebody comes in and said, "Hey, have you considered MAiD?" And they'll say no. And they'll be asked again, no. And then the family leaves for night, and then the patient is asked again when nobody's there to, you know, to support them. And this is a very recent example. A woman told me her dad was in the hospital and he had surgery and he was so anxious. He'd been hallucinating after the surgery, whatever. He'd been in the hospital for weeks and just was never getting out of the hospital, and they couldn't figure out why. And finally, he had told her that he was so stressed because every time a nurse came in to, you know, like do something with the IV, you know, give him his medication or whatever, he was scared he was being euthanized because he thought when he'd been hallucinating, he'd given permission to choose, like he wanted MAiD. So you know, and then once, you know, he was aware that no, that's not what happened. You're not going to die. You're not going to be euthanized. He totally relaxed and he was discharged within days after that. Like I hear so many stories from across the country of these crazy situations. And I mean, not every hospital is going to be the same. Like some hospitals would be, you know, not push it as much. Others will push it more. So you can't paint everybody with the same brush, but these are some of the experiences people are having.
So, thank you for sharing that, Susan. So let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about maybe how do we become a culture of life. And I have a question here, and it might be a bit of a loaded question, but how does how does the choosing of MAiD, because of the quality of life, reflect on the church's responsibility and mission to care for those around us?
Well, you know, I look back when I read about church history and I look back at Roman times.
Mm-hmm.
Christians, what drew people to Christianity is that the Christians were the ones caring for the discarded. They were picking up
Exactly.
babies from the gutters. They were taking in the disabled, caring for the elderly. And that is really what drew people to Christianity at that time. And I often think about the very thing, you know, the very people that kind of were the catalyst for Christianity, you know, really gaining some traction in terms of the vulnerable people. Those vulnerable people now are the ones we're discarding. And there's, to me, there just really is, there really is a connection. There's a connection. We you know, we think we're more civilized and we got maybe some other language and we can sanitize it. But Christians were the ones taking care of the people in Roman times that were discarded. But now these same people are being discarded in our time. But now it's, you know, it's viewed as compassion, right? When really it's not. What does it say about a society when we eliminate the disabled, the elderly, unwanted infants? So I think there's a huge opportunity for the church, to be honest, in this. I mean, think of how the church could set itself apart, or, you know, not even set itself apart, but think of the light the church could be if we're now, going to do something about this. But as Krisduerksen said before, there's a cost. There's an effort to this. I saw a video recently. It was a video of I think an 88-year-old man and his 53-year-old Down syndrome son. And it was the first time they'd been apart for a week. And so the son, I guess, had gone on a trip, and the dad had stayed home. And the video of them reuniting at the airport. And I mean, you can't help but cry. They're both crying. They're hugging each other. And I watched that video, and it really occurred to me how, you look at Down syndrome babies where the majority of them are aborted before they're born. And as I was watching that video, I thought, you know what? Like, we are we're taking the lives of the people that will give us meaning at the end of life, right? Like, we've really lost our perspective on what matters in life. Like, I'm a career woman. I like to work. I'm not saying that those things aren't important, but we're losing sight of what is the most important, because you know what? At the end of once we're done our jobs, once we're done our careers, people are going to forget about us. Like we're not all going to have this legacy where what we do, everybody's remembering what we've done. And what are we going to have when that's all over? It's our family, it's our friends, it's our relationships. So I think we really need to gain sight of that. Again, that it's relationships. A friend of mine's a nursing professor, and she said her nursing students that come from like the Philippines or international students or from some other, more community-oriented countries, like they can't fathom that we put our parents in nursing homes or care homes. They would just never do that where they're from. They take care of their parents. I'm not saying we need to go do that far here in terms of, okay, now we shouldn't have nursing homes, but those relationships are really important at the end. And it's not rocket science. We've all seen the data, how people are depressed and lonely, and how suicide and drug use and all these things are through the roof. Again, these are social issues. People need community. People need God first, obviously, but they need community, and we need to care about others.
Social issues becoming medical issues, loneliness and isolation, then causing people to want to die. I wonder, as you were just talking right now, it is cheaper and more efficient for us to kill more people. It is. It's cheaper, more efficient, but the investment of energy and time, family by family, patient by patient, person by person, to try to help people want to live is actually an investment, I think, in our national soul. It's in our community, in our souls. It makes us better.
And we all only need to reach one person. We don't need to reach everybody. And I think partly our social media culture, we've lost sight. Like, how many followers do we have? How many views do we have? How many likes do we have? Are we an influencer? And we're always thinking, like, unless we're reaching the masses, like, our lives maybe aren't successful or don't have value. Ultimately, we all just need to reach one person. And if we're all just, reaching one or two people in our sphere of influence, that would literally change the fabric of our culture. And I think it's empowering people to say, you know what, like, invest in somebody. But a lot of people feel like they're nobody. And when you feel like you're nobody, you don't reach out to anybody else. You're kind of expecting people maybe to reach out to you, but nobody's a nobody. Like, we all can reach out and build relationships, and we don't need to do it with everybody, but we just need to reach, the one or two in our own sphere of influence.
I love that. Because the goal is to create a culture of life whereby something like MAiD is just inconceivable, right? And and I love what you said there, because just reaching out to one person in our life is attainable. It's simple. It harkens back to the vision of Paul in the Philippians, where it's all about the other. We empty ourselves and we go to the other. We love the other. And so, what you said earlier about we live in such an individualistic society that we can't think about the other. And so, I really appreciate your emphasis there.
If Susan, as we're running out of time here. This is a great conversation on the political, as people are, and I'm not talking political in terms of how people vote who are listening to this at all. I'm talking about in terms of government decisions and funding and things that people listening to this podcast can be praying about or thinking about as they vote, as they talk to their representatives or whatever, or as a community. What are things? I love the one person challenge. We can each make a difference as a society, as a city, as a province. What are investments or things on the healthcare side of things or elsewhere that we should be talking about, voting for, asking for more of, that would help? It's going to cost money. Anything will cost money. Killing people saves money, but in this case, we want to spend money. What are things that we should be advocating for, praying for, that would help people die better and want to live more?
Okay, from the medical side, when our medical system was started, our population was much younger. So the medical system has been more established on acute care. You have a broken arm, go get that fixed. You get diagnosed with something, let's deal with that. It hasn't kept up with the aging population. And I think there needs to be an investment in palliative care. And by palliative care, that I mean a time of diagnosis. So a lot of people, when they hear palliative care, they actually think of it as hospice. Somebody's in palliative, they're going to die soon. That's hospice care. Palliative is helping people live well from time of diagnosis. So you're staying ahead of some of the conditions or some of the pain. So I think we need a lot more palliative specialists, maybe like nurse practitioners who are specializing in it, that type of thing. So a culture that we're aging. Now, how are we going to, manage all these things? And I think palliative needs to be overhauled. Now, the challenges with MAiD, again, like I said, the whole system, it's not just personal autonomy. The whole healthcare system now, it's starting in universities. It's going to the healthcare system. The whole culture is changing because of this. So it is concerning. But if we can I'm big on incremental gains. I know traditionally there's pro-life, kind of the pro-life movement is perceived as it's all or nothing. We either get there's no abortion, there's no MAiD. I don't think that's real. That's not realistic in our country. I mean, it's a good goal to strive for, but that's not coming. None of the parties want to address it. So why don't we look at incremental gains, where we can find incremental gains and just support things that are good policy, regardless of which political party is introducing it. We're so unbelievably polarized that it's like it doesn't really even. People just look to which party's supporting what, and then they support it or don't. There may be legitimately good policies introduced by any party, and then let's support those parties. I send letters. We have people sending letters, and they're not like mean letters or postcards or anything like that. It's just like, what can we bring this? Can we rein this in a little bit? What can we do? And I think it's a good exercise even for people, because then they do research and it takes some thought to write a little note to the government. But yeah, I think palliative care is the big thing, and we need to care about elderly people. I spoke at Nurses Christian Fellowship, or I think that's what it's called, a couple of weeks ago, and there was a couple of doctors at my table, and we were talking, and one doctor was talking about MAiD, and he just said how one of the things he's noticing is if there's friction in family relationships or dysfunctional families, the parents more likely to choose MAiD. There's issues, right? If a child and parent, haven't had a good relationship, the parent is more likely to choose MAiD. So I think about that often, and it's like, if we have a friend whose parent is suffering, maybe we need to step in sometime and encourage them and care for them, right? Because we don't know the dynamics. So again, it's this whole relational, social piece that's playing such a big part in this. So I would say relationships and palliative care, proper palliative care.
Oh, some good practical stuff there. As a pastor, I've been seeing this a lot too. And to anybody who's listening to this right now, if you have a friend or a family member with cancer, some kind of diagnosis, go visit them at their home or in the hospital. You wouldn't believe how many people I drop in on every week as a pastor. I drop in the hospital. I'm dropping by in people's homes who have got some kind of diagnosis. They're suffering. And over again, I hear that their friends and family hardly come around. And I know people are busy, but I think a huge challenge as individual Christians, and if you're listening to this, is if you have a friend who's sick or getting older and alone, go over there regularly and spend time. Well, thanks, Susan, so much for this conversation. Chris, was there something you want to pop in there at the end?
No, I really enjoyed this. Thank you,
Yeah, so
Susan,
did I.
for joining us here.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, that is it for another fun conversation. Make sure you come back again in 2 weeks for our next episode. And again, if this is a show that you have enjoyed and you are excited about, please help us out by liking, subscribing, and sharing this podcast as more episodes are released. If you have any questions about anything that has been said in these episodes, please let us know at outsidethewalls@crossviewchurch.ca. Thank you, and we will see you again.